Uh, this month we're taking a look at Yoga Sutras, and I think it finally I had an ambitious plan of unpacking various parts of the text, and as a teacher, I fall back on this simple idea, reliably so, again and again. And in a nutshell, less is more, and to prioritize depth over breadth. So to emphasize understanding a few things well in support of a kind of recognition that can be applied more universally, right? So if we just skim across the surface of many ideas, it may foster, a bit of stimulation in the moment. And how deeply do those ideas penetrate, or how able are we to actually carry them forth into our daily life and continue to reflect and hold them up against life's circumstance and so forth. So some measure of depth really aids in the learning process. And what's more, any one of the Yoga Sutras contains the entire message. If you burrow down deeper and deep enough and further with it, so it's not as though we're missing out on all the good stuff or the juicy. I mean, it's all fascinating, of course, but this principle of realization is throughout the text. So we have people kind of popping in and out of the series. So I'll kind of recap where we've been thus far. We're just at the beginning of book one, and the first 5 sutras, in many ways, lay down the essential groundwork or the core principles or what we're getting at fundamentally. And then the rest of the text is an expansion of these core ideas that are set down in the initial five lines, or even the very first word of the very first sutra, which is ata, which means now, as in now, like the eternal present. Now the study of yoga, and less as, say, an age-old proclamation, like, oh yes, back in the day, Patanjali said, now we're studying yoga, and he meant it back then. I mean, the choice that you all made to come here to study yoga is like the living legacy of this idea, right? That it lives on and carries forth, and in many ways is a cornerstone. As I love to say, in order for the practices to work, we have to do them, right? There's, there needs to be an hour studying yoga in our life in a regular basis, if indeed we are. And from there, he gives the cornerstone definition of yoga, which is yoga is the stilling of all thought. Yoga is the stilling of all thought, or cessation of all thought, or control, or the arresting, stop. The word is nirotana. Nirotana means these many things, and starts to take on a different tenor, depending if you want to call it control, arrest, stop, cease. Personally, I've landed on stilling from a guy named Edward Brand, which implies both a final destination, as in it's still, or nearly stopped or stopped, but also a process, ing, the stilling of all thought, and which in my present state, I can relate to that process of stilling. However you want to massage these words, and that's the kind of fascinating complexity of this text, is we can really get into a great deal of nuance in just the language alone, right? The language alone. What are the implications of stilling, resting, ceasing, etc.? But in any case, the proposition is, whatever that is, that yoga of the arrested mind is beyond all comprehension, all knowing, no, all objectification, all objecting, all thinking, all self and othering is dissolved in that realization. Yoga is what happens when your mind stops. Like, who would we be without this ongoing narrative, telling its stories, weaving its enchantment, taking us for a ride. Which leads us to Sutra 3, which says tada drashtu svarupane, which means then the seer, like the perennial witness, the one who's, maybe you go to enough yoga classes, you start to get a taste of this, the one who can kind of pull back from the impulsivity of the mind, then the seer is established in their true nature, or to borrow from the language of say, the Vedanta, and the self abides in the self. And Krishna says something similar to that in Bhagavad Gita, just that the soul is at rest in its own nature. Nothing is missing, and there's nothing to try to strive for, or glean, or gather, or covet, or desire, or then the self rests in its true and essential nature, which is whole and complete. Certainly much more whole and complete than the multitudinous fluctuations of the mind, which, I don't know if you've noticed, but at least in my experience, my day consists of, in many ways, just trying to maintain a certain bandwidth of goodness. And more or less holding space for this, level 7 happiness. I'll call it good. And anything goes below that, it certainly gets my attention. Okay, now there's a problem. Better fix that. What do I have to do? All this cleverness that uploads. Or if there's joy, it's like, look at me, 8, 9, 9. And there's a parking ticket, and so there goes the dance. But the seer is perennially at peace, perennially at rest, perennially whole. And then so, to kind of further continue, the next progression says, at other states, Sutra 4, 1.4, Vritti Sarupyam Itaratra. At other states, at other times, the seer, so when the seer is not established in its essential nature, at other times, the seer appears the same as the thought waves in the mind. At other times, the seer appears, your witness, your soul, appears the same as the mental content. In other words, we become, our essence becomes identified with the changing, fluctuating, our eternal, perennially at peace essence becomes identified with the fluctuations, the changing fluctuations of the mind, as though it were me. Like, I am my thoughts. I am my grief. I am my disappointment. I am my elation, and so forth. And the journey of this is very much the milieu of the human experience and psyche. is this identification with thought. So much so that you might even look at me like, what are you talking about? Of course I'm my thoughts, you know. That's the only reality. I am actually, well, we make up a lot of stories about who we are and whatnot, but the yoga, the proposition in yoga is that this is not the supreme reality. Your the identification with the finite nature of thought, the turnings of the mind is not the definitive description of truth. It's a relative, it's a subjective description of reality. So the deeper proposition, it's sort of I find this an interesting way of holding the yoga process is just to get like really curious about like what's really going on here. What's the kind of underlying truth of this creation or existence or experience or consciousness? You know, if you find any of those questions intriguing, then you know yoga might be a good thing to take up. You know, because it's seeking to crack that kind of nut. You know, to dislodge us from many an assumption. And by the way, assumptions that don't always uphold our highest nature by definition. And begin to peer more and more into a broader view. Right? So, vritti svarupyam itaratra. Then in other times, the seer appears the same as the thought waves in the mind, right? And untangling that knot is the work of yoga in many ways, and as certain Patanjali goes about, you know, offering some insight and perspective on that process in many ways. And then finally goes on to say, so now we're moving into like a working model here. So, well, we already have, there's a lot to go off of in the prior verses, but then Vritaya Panchataya Klishta Klishta. The thought waves, fluctuations of the mind, are fivefold. Whoa. I experienced a lot of different kinds of thoughts, and I thought they were all so important, and this one's so nuanced, and this one's so impressive, and this one's so creative, and this one's so loving, and this one's so angry, and you know, like, whoa, those are many, but he's just saying there's five of them. There's five actually ways that we think. It's not as impressive. They're like valid, you know, correct perception, incorrect perception, memory, nidra, sleep, and imagination. That's it. That's the framework of what happens in the mental space. This kind of five basic and combinations thereof. You could have like an accurate dream or an imaginary dream, right? As you put these things together. And then finally, and this is sort of a nod at there's many things we could say about this, but what's occurring to me now is this is, you know, a gesture towards the path that's to come. It says that they're either these five kinds of thoughts are either painful or non-painful. Wow, now you got my attention. I'm curious. Tell me about the non-painful thoughts. Like, how do we go about that one? Well, you know, it's kind of hard-baked yoga stuff. It's, you know, it often comes back to your own effort and like willingness. You know, it's not like, oh well, then you sprinkle glitter over your forehead and you're done. It's so he makes a distinction between pravriti and nivritti. Vritti is turning a thought. Pravritti means outward going mind. And you characterize those as painful. So when we're identified with the externals, which is quite often. And then nivritti is, and like what is painful is a worthwhile question that takes further unpacking. So we're just going to leave it at the generic painful, non-painful. But what does he mean by pain is important in this. So I don't want to just give you the impression that, you know, if you look outside, then you're like, it's going to feel like someone poked you with a needle. That's not what that's not where we're going with this. But he does say, just sort of broad strokes here, that the thoughts that have us orient inwards, that support involution, that support self-reflection, understanding, you know, classified as akrishta or non-painful thoughts. This is, again, important details surrounding this characterization of what we're calling painful that I'm sure we'll get into in the sutra unit down the road. But that's the basic framework. So now the study of yoga. Yoga is the cessation of mental modification or stilling of all thought. At other times, seer appears the same as thought waves in the mind. Thought waves are fivefold. Some are painful, some are not. And then so then the unpacking from there gets magnified. All right. Well, that's a lot to try to compress into Trikonasana, certainly. So I think we'll just kind of nudge our practice session towards this stilling of thought here. We'll do that, and honestly, like pranayama meditation are the deeper tools for that. So we'll do asana, of course, and everything in preparation for more meditative practice. So with that, let's start, Steve.